Before you decide what this video means, there's something you need to notice first. Not the words, not the title, not even why you clicked. Notice your reaction. If something in you tightened slightly, not fear, not excitement, but a quiet alertness. That's not random. That's recognition before explanation. And moments like that don't happen often. This is not a video you casually agree with or disagree with. It's not here to motivate you. And it's definitely not here to make you feel special. This is a checkpoint. Some of you arrived here because the last video shifted something, not emotionally, structurally. You didn't feel inspired. You felt oriented. And now there's a single question sitting underneath everything else. Now what? That question doesn't come from curiosity. It comes from consequence. Not because after you've been seen, truly seen, even if no one announced it, you don't return to the same internal position. The rules don't change loudly. They change quietly. And if you don't recognize that shift, this is where most people collapse. Not because they aren't capable, but because they misread the phase. So let me be precise about what this video is and isn't. This is not about becoming more powerful. It's not about decoding signs or chasing meaning. And it's not about assuming every moment now carries cosmic significance. This is about stability after recognition. What happens when life doesn't explode, but subtly tightens? When nothing dramatic occurs, yet nothing feels neutral anymore. When you realize you're no longer moving invisibly, but you're also not being guided. Yeah, that space right there is where most people either inflate their ego, freeze completely, or start making impulsive decisions they later have to undo. This video exists to prevent that. If you're watching this and thinking, I feel more awake but also heavier, that's not a problem to solve. It's a condition to understand. Before we go further, I want you to do something simple, not for engagement, but for grounding. If you watched the last video and didn't click away halfway through, type, I stayed in the comments. No explanation, no story, just that. Because staying matters more than reacting right now. Here's what I can tell you up front. Being seen doesn't make your life easier. It makes it more exact. It removes certain excuses. It narrows certain options. And it asks something most people aren't prepared for. Consistency without reassurance. This video will walk you through what actually changes after that point, what to expect, what to avoid, and why nothing big happening yet is not a failure, but a sign you're in the right phase. If you're here looking for drama, you won't find it. If you're here looking for clarity, stay. Because from this point forward, movement isn't about intensity, it's about alignment. And alignment doesn't rush, but it doesn't wait forever either. What you're standing in right now did not begin with this video. It didn't begin when you felt the shift. It didn't begin when things slowed down. And it didn't begin when you started asking deeper questions. This moment was already in motion long before you became conscious of it. Most people are taught to think of progress as something reactive, that opportunities appear when effort is noticed, when timing feels right, or when circumstances improve. That model works for linear paths. It does not apply to trajectories that carry consequence beyond the individual. You were never moving on a random timeline. Your life has followed a pattern that doesn't make sense if measured by speed alone. Momentum came late. Access was delayed. Doors appeared and then stalled just before opening fully. And often, right when acceleration seemed inevitable, something intervened. Not failure, not collapse, containment. Collapse removes you from the system. Containment keeps you inside it. Under observation, under pressure, without clear feedback. That distinction matters, because containment isn't designed to test your patience. It's designed to test what remains intact when progress is restricted. Most people don't survive that phase without distortion. They become resentful. They cut corners. They trade coherence for momentum just to escape the discomfort of waiting. But you didn't do that. You adapted without becoming reckless. You waited without abandoning your internal standards. You absorbed silence without demanding validation. That combination is not common. And when something uncommon persists under delay, systems don't rush it forward. They schedule it. A scheduled moment is not about readiness in the emotional sense. It's about alignment between multiple conditions that cannot be forced. Your internal structure had to stabilize. External distortions had to clear. Now, and the environment had to reach a point where moving you forward no longer created unnecessary damage. Until those variables aligned, acceleration would have been irresponsible, not for you, but for what your movement would affect. That's why the waiting felt intentional even when it was frustrating. You weren't being ignored. You were being held in place while the system calibrated around you. And here's the part that often goes unnoticed. Scheduled moments don't arrive with excitement. They arrive with pressure, a subtle tightening, a sense that neutrality has disappeared, an awareness that continuing to drift carries a different cost than it used to. You may have felt this as restlessness without urgency, or clarity without relief, or the realization that certain options are no longer viable, even if they're still available. That's not coincidence. That's timing becoming visible. A scheduled moment doesn't ask whether you feel ready. It reveals whether delay has completed its function, and once that function is complete, the moment does not reschedule itself. This is the part most people misunderstand. They assume scheduled moments are rewards. They are not. They are release points. Points where containment ends and consequence begins, where potential shifts into placement, where waiting becomes more dangerous than movement. Nothing about this is dramatic on the surface, but internally something changes. You stop asking when will it happen and start sensing it's already happening. That awareness isn't meant to excite you, it's meant to orient you. Because scheduled moments don't exist to be admired. They exist to be responded to. And response, not intention, is what determines what happens next. When people hear the idea of being watched, the mind jumps immediately to danger, investigation, suspicion, a sense that something is wrong. That reaction is instinctive, but it's also inaccurate. Because systems do not investigate what they consider insignificant. They investigate errors, they investigate threats, they investigate failures. What you are experiencing now does not carry the signature of suspicion. It carries the signature of attention. And attention follows a very different logic. Investigation looks for what went wrong. Observation looks for what holds under pressure. Most people are never observed. They pass through systems unnoticed because they behave exactly as expected. When delayed, they deteriorate. When ignored, they lose coherence. When pressure builds without reward, they distort, cutting corners, chasing shortcuts, abandoning internal standards just to feel movement again. That pattern is predictable. You did not follow it. Under delay, you did not fracture. Under silence, you did not collapse into recklessness. Under uncertainty, you did not trade integrity for momentum. That deviation is what draws attention, not because it is dramatic, but because it is rare. This is why nothing overt has happened. No confrontation, no accusation, no moment where you were called in or forced to explain yourself. Instead, you may have noticed something subtler. A sense that certain actions feel heavier than they used to, that choices no longer feel neutral, that being careless carries consequences faster, even without feedback. That isn't fear, that's relevance. Being investigated produces anxiety. Being observed produces pressure without explanation. And pressure without explanation is not meant to scare you. It's meant to reveal you. Observation is quiet by design. It doesn't interfere. It doesn't correct. It doesn't reassure. It watches how you move when you believe no one is guiding you, how you behave when effort goes unseen, how you handle proximity to power without access to it, how you respond when progress slows again after almost accelerating. Most people reveal instability here. They rush, they overperform, they explain too much, they reach for validation disguised as transparency. Observation doesn't reward that. What it looks for is durability without distortion. Can you maintain clarity without applause? Can you hold restraint without resentment? Can you stay coherent when outcomes remain uncertain? That's what's being assessed. Not your talent, not your potential, not your story, your structure. This is why the pressure you feel now doesn't come with instructions. No one is telling you what to do next. No one is confirming whether you're doing it right. No one is giving you the relief of certainty. That absence is intentional. When systems prepare to reposition someone, they remove external signals and watch what remains. They want to see whether alignment holds when guidance disappears. This phase can feel disorienting if you misinterpret it. If you assume you're being judged, you'll become defensive. If you assume you're being tested, you'll perform. If you assume you're being threatened, you'll react. All of those responses miss the point. Observation is not a test you pass by effort. It's a condition you reveal yourself through. And here's the critical distinction. Observation always precedes reassignment. Not promotion in the superficial sense. Not elevation as reward. Reassignment as placement. Moving you into a position where your decisions carry weight beyond you. That's why this phase feels heavier than anything before it. Not because something bad is coming, but because what comes next will no longer tolerate fragmentation. Once observation ends, invisibility does not return. Not because you're trapped, but because expectation replaces ambiguity. And expectation, once applied, does not announce itself. It simply becomes the new environment you operate in. That's where you are now. Not under suspicion, not under threat, but under attention. And attention, unlike investigation, only appears when what you do next actually matters. The most damaging moments in your life did not come from open opposition. They came from proximity, from someone close enough to influence timing, close enough to shape perception, close enough that you lowered your guard without realizing it. That's why the pain lingered longer than it should have. This wasn't an enemy across the field. It wasn't resistance you could prepare for or confront. It was interference, wrapped in familiarity, support on the surface, concern in tone, but just enough redirection beneath it to slow momentum at critical moments. And because it didn't look hostile, you questioned yourself instead of the pattern. You replayed conversations. You rationalized delays. You told yourself you were being too sensitive, too reactive, too suspicious. And that internal conflict did more damage than the interference itself. What made this painful was not malice. It was misalignment combined with access. The woman who blocked you was not powerful in the obvious sense. She didn't control outcomes directly. She controlled friction. Timing softened here. Information filtered there. Momentum reframed as not yet, or be careful, or this might not be the right moment. And because the language sounded reasonable, you hesitated. This is where most people misunderstand betrayal. They assume it requires intention, jealousy, cruelty, conscious sabotage. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it emerges when insecurity meets proximity to potential. Not because the other person wants to harm you, but because your forward movement destabilizes something they rely on, their role, their relevance, their sense of position. That discomfort doesn't always turn into aggression. Often it turns into interference disguised as protection. And that's why it's so hard to name. You don't feel attacked. You feel confused. You sense resistance, but you can't point to a clear source. You feel slowed, but you can't justify confronting anyone. So you internalize it. You delay yourself. You second-guess clarity. You wait for confirmation that never arrives. That's the real damage. Not the blockage, but the way it trains you to doubt your own orientation. And here's the critical shift you need to make now. This was not about who she was as a person. It was about the position she occupied in that phase of your life. She had access at a moment when access mattered. She was close enough to influence direction before alignment was locked. Oh, that made her a filter, not a final obstacle. Filters appear when something is about to accelerate beyond a certain threshold. They don't exist to stop movement entirely. They exist to see what happens when movement is distorted. Do you abandon your center? Do you fight the wrong battle? Do you force momentum at the cost of coherence? Or do you pause, recalibrate, and refuse to move until direction is clean? That's what the filter measures. And here's how you know this phase has ended. The interference stopped without confrontation. Clarity returned without explanation. Momentum no longer feels blocked, just contained. If she had been the real obstacle, you would still be stuck. The fact that you're no longer entangled in confusion means the function completed its role. The pattern ran its course. This is where you let go of the story. Not because the pain wasn't real, not because the delay didn't cost you something, but because staying focused on the person keeps you from seeing the structure, and the structure is what matters moving forward. Patterns like this don't repeat forever. They repeat until recognized. Once recognized, they lose their leverage. Because interference through proximity only works when you haven't learned to protect direction without becoming defensive. You don't need revenge. You don't need exposure. You don't need closure through confrontation. The closure is structural. You no longer grant access without alignment. You no longer confuse concern with authority. You no longer delay movement waiting for validation from someone positioned to benefit from your hesitation. That's not bitterness. That's discernment forged under pressure. The pain marked the end of innocence, not trust, but unexamined trust. And once that innocence ends, the same kind of blockage cannot happen again, because the filter did its job. And now, it's gone. When truth begins to surface, the first impulse is to believe it's happening for you, to balance something, to correct a wrong, to finally put words to what you endured. That assumption is understandable, but it's incomplete. What is being revealed now is not emerging to validate your pain, and it's not surfacing so you can reclaim control. This is not revenge. Revenge is emotional. It requires intention, timing, and participation. What's happening now requires none of that. Truth surfaces when distortion reaches its functional limit. Systems can tolerate confusion for a long time. They can tolerate inefficiency. They can even tolerate misalignment, as long as it doesn't interfere with movement. But when distortion begins to obstruct trajectory, it stops being personal and becomes structural. That's when correction begins. Not dramatically, not publicly, and not with your involvement. Information clarifies itself, timelines realign. Conversations that once felt confusing suddenly make sense without anyone explaining them. This kind of exposure doesn't ask for your reaction. It removes the need for it. And that's how you know you've moved into a different phase. Earlier, truth would have required effort from you. You would have needed to explain, defend, or confront. Silence would have cost you something. Now, silence does the opposite. It protects the process. This is where many people make a critical mistake. And they assume that because truth is surfacing, they're meant to step in, to finally say what they've been holding back, to correct the narrative, to ensure their side is understood. That instinct belongs to an earlier stage. At this stage, intervention doesn't accelerate resolution. It contaminates it. Because the moment you reinsert yourself emotionally, you reattach to a structure that is already correcting itself. That's not strength. That's attachment. Truth that arrives without your fingerprints is clean. It doesn't belong to you. It doesn't need your energy. And it doesn't require you to manage outcomes. That can feel unsettling if you're used to effort being the engine of change. But this phase is not about effort. It's about release. Release from defending your integrity. Release from clarifying intent. Release from carrying distortion that entered your life through proximity, not truth. This is why restraint matters now, not because you're powerless, but because power applied at the wrong moment becomes noise. You don't gain anything by being right out loud. You gain alignment by letting correction complete without interference. And here's the distinction that matters most. Truth is not surfacing to make you feel vindicated. It's surfacing to remove friction from what comes next. Elevation built on unresolved distortion is unstable. So the system clears distortion first. Not to reward you, not to punish anyone else, but to restore orientation. Once that happens, movement becomes possible without entanglement. This is why you don't need to revisit the past now. You don't need to expose anyone. You don't need to defend your decisions. You don't need to explain why you waited or why you hesitated. The correction is already underway. Your responsibility is not to control it. Your responsibility is to not slow it down. Silence, in this phase, is not avoidance. It's cooperation with a process that no longer needs your effort. And when truth finishes its work, you don't step forward to claim it. You step forward because the obstruction is gone. Not for revenge, not for closure, for repositioning. For a long time, delay felt like rejection, like being passed over without explanation, like effort that never quite converted into momentum, like watching others move forward while you remained stationary, wondering what you were missing. And if you're honest, there were moments when the delay felt personal, not dramatic, just quietly discouraging. But here is the distinction that only becomes visible later. Rejection pushes you away. Protection holds you back. What you experienced was not doors slamming shut. It was doors never fully opening, not because you weren't capable of walking through them, but because what waited on the other side would have required commitments that were misaligned with where you were meant to end up. This is the part most people don't like to confront. Some opportunities are dangerous when they arrive too early. Not because they fail, but because they succeed in the wrong structure. Had certain things moved faster, you would have been required to accept proximity before discernment matured, trade long-term clarity for short-term access, anchor your future to people or systems that would later limit you. That kind of progress looks like advancement, but it creates structural entanglement. So instead, momentum stalled, not collapsed, not denied, contained. This is why rejection never felt clean. True rejection is decisive. It shuts things down clearly and forces redirection. What you experienced was ambiguous, interest that surfaced, then cooled without explanation, openings that appeared close, then quietly receded. Moments where alignment felt almost right, but not stable enough to hold. That ambiguity wasn't confusion, it was protection, operating without ceremony. While you were waiting, something else was happening. Your tolerance for misalignment was decreasing. Your sensitivity to distortion was sharpening. Your dependence on external validation was eroding. In other words, the delay wasn't empty time. It was structural preparation. A preparation not for speed, but for irreversibility. Because once movement resumed, it wouldn't be easily undone, and this is where the phase changes. Delay functions as protection only up to a point. After that point, it becomes a liability. There comes a moment when what once kept you safe begins to keep you small. That's how you know the function of delay has completed. You feel it internally before anything changes externally. Waiting no longer feels wise. It feels evasive. Patience no longer feels grounded. It feels costly. Stability begins to resemble stagnation. This is not restlessness, it's timing pressure. The system that once slowed you to prevent misalignment is now withdrawing that constraint. Not because you proved something, not because you earned permission, but because the conditions that required delay no longer exist. And here's the part that matters now. Protection ends quietly. There is no announcement, no validation, no moment where someone confirms, yes, now it's time. The signal is internal. What once felt like wisdom begins to feel like avoidance. What once felt like caution begins to feel like self-betrayal. That's not a moral failure, it's a phase transition. And this is why delay cannot be extended indefinitely. Systems do not preserve potential forever. They reposition it when conditions align, or they move forward without it. This is where rejection becomes the wrong word. What's happening now is not rejection returning, it's protection expiring. And when protection expires, consequence enters the picture. Movement begins to matter more than intention. Hesitation begins to cost more than error. And clarity becomes less about feeling ready and more about refusing to remain misaligned. You're not being pushed forward. You're being released. And release, unlike rejection, does not come with reassurance. It comes with responsibility. When this moment arrives, it almost never looks the way people expect. There is no dramatic notification, no clear signal that says, this is the turning point, no sense of arrival that matches the weight you've been carrying. That's because what's approaching is not an event designed to impress you, it's a strategic intersection. The meeting does not happen because you finally earned it. It does not happen because someone decided to reward your patience. And it does not happen by coincidence. It happens because multiple conditions reached alignment at the same time. Your internal structure stabilized, the external distortions cleared, and the system no longer benefited from keeping you contained. That convergence creates access, not opportunity in the motivational sense, but placement. This is why the meeting may feel surprisingly ordinary. It could be a conversation that seems informal, an invitation framed as routine, a moment where someone listens differently than before. Nothing about it announces importance, and that's intentional. If the moment were dramatic, you would prepare emotionally instead of strategically. You would perform instead of position. You would reach for validation instead of clarity. That's not what's being assessed here. At this stage, what matters is not how impressive you sound. It's how little you need to prove. This is where many people fail. They treat the meeting like an audition. They over-explain their history. They volunteer context that wasn't requested. They fill silence because they mistake it for danger. That behavior belongs to the phase before observation ended. This phase is different. The meeting is not about convincing anyone of your value. It's about confirming alignment under pressure. What's being evaluated is subtle. Can you remain precise without reassurance? Can you respond without reaching for control? Can you hold clarity without narrating your struggle? These are not soft skills. They determine whether repositioning creates stability or friction. This is why restraint matters more than charisma now. Not because you're meant to be passive, but because unnecessary motion creates noise. And noise interferes with placement. Here's something most people don't realize. You are not walking into this moment alone. Not emotionally, but structurally. The conditions that once delayed you are already gone. The filters have completed their function. The distortions that required containment have expired. So the meeting does not open the door. It confirms that the door is already unlocked. Your role is not to push. It's to step through without dragging the past with you. No defense, no explanation, no reference to how hard it was to get here, because the meeting is not about your story. It's about where you're placed next. And placement is never negotiated through effort. It's confirmed through presence. This is why the meeting doesn't repeat. If you miss it by overperforming, the system doesn't chase you. It doesn't argue. It doesn't warn. It simply moves forward with another configuration. That's not punishment, that's efficiency. This is what one shot actually refers to. Not pressure to succeed, but precision required to align. When the moment arrives, your task is simple, but not easy. Be exact. Be contained. Be ready to move without needing permission. Because the meeting isn't accidental. It's the system verifying whether the delay did what it was meant to do, and whether you can now operate without it. For a long time, you were taught to doubt what you sensed. Not directly, not aggressively, but subtly. Through correction, through dismissal, through being told to wait and see, to be rational, to trust explanations that sounded reasonable even when something in you resisted. So you learned to reinterpret what you felt. You called it anxiety, overthinking, sensitivity, impatience, anything that made it easier to ignore. But that label never quite fit, because what you were responding to wasn't chaos. It was incongruence. You noticed when timing felt off, even if logic said it was fine. You felt hesitation around decisions that looked perfect on paper. You sensed distortion in people who said the right things but moved just slightly out of alignment. That wasn't fear. It was discernment activating before evidence arrived. Most people only trust their perception after outcomes confirm it. You didn't have that luxury. You had to feel your way through situations where proof came late or never, and live with the cost of being right too early. That's why the pressure you experienced felt internal rather than external. Your nervous system was registering patterns your conscious mind didn't yet have language for. And because there was no language, it felt like instability. But instability reacts. What you had was calibration. Calibration tightens as stakes increase. That's why your tolerance for almost right situations has dropped. Why you no longer feel comfortable moving forward just because something is available. Why reassurance now feels weaker than silence. Your intuition didn't suddenly appear. It refined. Under delay, under disappointment, under proximity to distortion. Each time you ignored it, the cost increased. Each time you honored it, alignment returned, even if clarity lagged. That's how you know it was never wrong. What's changed now is not the signal. It's the consequence of ignoring it. Earlier, an intuition functioned as an early warning system. It helped you avoid misalignment when the stakes were still low. Now, it functions as navigation, because what lies ahead cannot be undone easily. This is why hesitation feels different now. It's no longer confusion. It's a checkpoint, a pause that exists not to delay you, but to prevent irreversible misplacement. At this stage, intuition doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you what not to compromise. It flags. When timing is real, but direction is wrong, when opportunity exists, but alignment doesn't, when movement would require trading coherence for relief, this is why you feel less flexible than before. Not rigid, exact. And here's the responsibility that comes with this clarity. You don't get to outsource discernment anymore, not to advice, not to urgency, not to consensus. Once intuition reaches this level of precision, ignoring it isn't innocence. It's avoidance, and avoidance at this stage doesn't slow outcomes. It misaligns them. Your intuition was never wrong. It was early, and being early meant carrying uncertainty without validation. It meant feeling pressure without explanation. It meant standing alone in decisions before there was evidence to support them. Now, evidence is no longer required. Only alignment is. And alignment, once felt this clearly, doesn't argue. It doesn't persuade. It doesn't demand belief. It waits, briefly, and then moves on. Whether you follow it or not, being seen is often misunderstood as relief, as recognition, as arrival, as the moment where pressure finally lifts and effort is rewarded. That misunderstanding is exactly why this phase breaks so many people. Visibility does not remove weight. It redistributes it. When you were unseen, your margin for error was wide. You could recalibrate quietly. You could make mistakes without ripple effects. You could afford inconsistency without it altering trajectory. That is no longer true. Being seen does not come with applause. It comes with expectation, without instruction. No one announces that the rules have changed, but you feel it immediately. Words land harder, decisions echo longer, misalignment shows faster, not because someone is watching closely, but because your position now interacts with more variables. This is not scrutiny. It's amplification. Whatever was minor before becomes structural now. Habits you once ignored start interfering with clarity. Relationships you tolerated begin distorting direction. And inconsistencies you explained away start creating friction you can no longer rationalize. That isn't punishment. That's responsibility arriving without ceremony. And here's the part. Most people resist. You are not responsible for being perfect. You are responsible for being coherent. Coherence means your actions match your values without explanation. Your pace reflects your priorities, not your anxiety. Your environment supports the direction you claim to be moving. This is where many people confuse visibility with permission. They loosen discipline instead of tightening it. They expand access instead of refining boundaries. They assume recognition equals safety. It doesn't. Visibility increases consequence, not because the system becomes hostile, but because it becomes efficient. Efficiency has no tolerance for unnecessary friction. This is why self-management becomes non-negotiable at this stage. Not in a performative sense, not to appear disciplined or impressive, but to prevent distortion from accumulating where it can no longer be ignored. And this includes things people like to minimize or spiritualize away. Your routines, your physical environment, your energy expenditure, your relationship to distraction. None of this is superficial anymore. When stakes rise, small inefficiencies compound quickly. This is where the fantasy of the chosen one collapses for many. They wanted the recognition. They wanted the sense of difference. They wanted the affirmation that their waiting meant something. They did not want the maintenance. Because maintenance is quiet. It doesn't feed identity. It requires consistency without feedback. But this is where actual positioning stabilizes. When you can maintain internal order without external enforcement. When you can say no without justification. When you can move deliberately without needing reassurance. This is not about morality. It's about capacity. The system does not elevate people because they feel ready. It elevates people who can carry complexity without fragmentation. And here is the harder truth. If you cannot manage coherence yourself, the system will manage it for you. Through constraint. Opportunities narrow. Choices reduce. Pressure increases. Not as punishment, as correction. This is why discipline now feels different than it did before. It's no longer about proving worth. It's about protecting trajectory. You're not being asked to become rigid. You're being asked to become precise. And precision looks unremarkable from the outside. It means saying less, but meaning more. Moving when alignment is clear, not when urgency peaks. Removing what interferes, even if it once felt necessary. This is the cost of being seen, not exposure, but accountability to a higher standard of internal order. And this is where many people quietly opt out. They tell themselves they want simplicity. They call it peace. They frame retreat as wisdom. Sometimes it is, Often it's avoidance dressed in language that sounds mature. Because real responsibility does not feel calming at first. It feels sobering. It strips away the ability to blame timing, circumstance, or misunderstanding. It removes the buffer between intention and consequence. From here on, your life doesn't get smaller, it gets more exact. And exactness demands something most people never develop: the ability to remain consistent when no one is correcting you, the ability to hold alignment when no one is guiding you, the ability to carry visibility without turning it into identity. Being seen is not the end of the journey. It's the moment where excuses expire. From here forward, the question is no longer, am I worthy? It is, can I sustain alignment when no one is telling me what to do? Because visibility is rarely revoked. But responsibility, that is enforced, and how you respond to that enforcement determines whether being seen becomes expansion or compression. It's natural to assume that everything up to this point was leading toward an ending, a conclusion, a release, a moment where tension resolves and effort finally pays off in a way that feels complete. That assumption is understandable, but it's also inaccurate. What you are standing in right now is not the end of a process. It's the opening of a different one. Endings close loops. Openings change the terrain. And what changes here is not who you are. It's how your actions interact with reality. Before, growth happened mostly internally, quietly, often without witnesses. You built depth without recognition. You carried pressure without reinforcement. You developed discernment without instruction. That phase shaped you. But shaping is not the same as placement. Now placement begins, and placement does not feel like relief. It feels like exposure to consequence without buffers. There is less room for trial and error, less tolerance for half alignment, and less forgiveness for drifting while telling yourself you're still figuring things out. Not because you're being judged, but because what you do now touches structures larger than your personal development. This is where many people misread the moment. They think they've arrived, that they can finally slow down, that the weight should lift now, that clarity should feel peaceful. But arrival is static. What's happening here is activation. You're moving from preparation to participation. From internal coherence to external consequence. From potential to positioning. And positioning doesn't come with celebration. It comes with clarity. Clarity about what no longer fits. Clarity about what cannot be carried forward. Clarity about the cost of pretending certain things haven't changed. This is why some attachments feel heavier now. Old narratives, old roles, old ways of explaining yourself. They don't collapse dramatically. They simply stop being sustainable, not because they were wrong, but because they were designed for a version of you that no longer exists. This opening does not ask you to reinvent yourself. It asks you to stop maintaining what's outdated, and that can feel like loss. Not the loss of opportunity, but the loss of excuses. You no longer get to attribute stagnation to circumstances alone. You no longer get to hide behind preparation. You no longer get to wait for permission disguised as certainty. That's why this phase feels quieter, but heavier. The noise is gone. The signal is clear. And clarity does not soothe. It demands orientation. This is also where comparison loses its grip. And not because you've surpassed others, but because their timelines stop being relevant. You're no longer moving laterally within the same frame. You're operating under a different set of constraints. That's what an opening actually is. Not a reward, a reorientation. It doesn't close the past by explaining it. It renders it unnecessary. You don't need closure when direction is established, and that's the invitation here. Not to look back and make sense of everything, but to move forward without dragging unfinished explanations behind you. This isn't the end of waiting. It's the end of waiting without consequence. From here on, movement matters. Not in volume, not in speed, in alignment. Because openings don't ask whether you're ready. They reveal whether you can move forward without needing the past to validate you. And that is the shift that defines this moment. Not completion, commencement. This is the point where most messages soften, where they summarize, where they reassure, where they tell you that everything will be fine. This is not that ending, because if you've stayed until now, it's not because you needed encouragement. It's because something in you already crossed a line, quietly, internally, and you didn't look away. You're not leaving this video with new information. You're leaving with a different orientation. And orientation changes behavior, whether you announce it or not. From this point forward, certain things will feel heavier, not emotionally, structurally. Silence will carry more information than noise. Misalignment will cost more than effort. Waiting without clarity will no longer feel neutral. That isn't pressure being imposed on you. That's consequence becoming visible. You don't need to explain what you're stepping into. You don't need to convince anyone you're ready. And you don't need to revisit the past to justify moving forward. The shift has already happened. What comes next will speak for itself, not through intensity, not through performance, but through placement. If something in this video unsettled you, don't rush to resolve it. Unsettling moments are not meant to be fixed immediately. They're meant to recalibrate direction. This is where discipline replaces anticipation, where consistency replaces explanation, where you stop asking, does this make sense to others, and start asking, is this aligned? And here's the final truth to hold on to. Being chosen is not about privilege. It's about exposure to consequence without cushioning. Most people want the identity. Very few are willing to carry the weight quietly. If you're still here, that tells me enough. So here's what to do next. Not as instruction, but as alignment. If this message clarified something you couldn't previously articulate, acknowledge it. You can do that by liking the video. Not for me, but to mark the moment for yourself. If you recognize that this isn't a one-time realization, but a sequence you're moving through, subscribe. Continuity matters more than intensity now. And if you're willing to engage, not emotionally but consciously, leave a comment, not a story, not an explanation, just where you are now. Because articulation locks orientation in place. This channel isn't here to motivate you. It's here to maintain coherence as things accelerate. The door is open, not forever, not dramatically, but long enough for those who recognize it to move. Whether you step through or not is no longer a matter of readiness. It's a matter of response. And response, once delayed too long, becomes a decision in itself.